Okay, so the next part of this presentation by me, as hopefully you'll have just read, is going to be just to provide actually quite a bit of information about the system of Panama. And what I would like you to do as I'm talking through my points is to be thinking in a very conscious and active way and trying to see if the information that I'm providing you with, the empirical information, fits in any way into any of the aspects of food regimes as you understand it. Hopefully this will help you practice a little bit about how to use a food regimes framework to read an empirical situation. And I think at this point, my plan is that we will use this material as a point of discussion in class. So hopefully you can do quite a lot of the analytical work yourselves. Then we can talk about that in class. I can help you validate some of the interpretations you might have made. So we can solidify that, and then possibly, if you wanted to, you could push deeper into developing the research. So let's have a go at this spot the food regimes aspects exercise. So just to revisit and help set the scene a little bit more, we know the geography of Panama. Now, what I think I might not have mentioned is the way that the unique physical geography of the country becomes almost sets the country as a linchpin of regional and increasingly international and ultimately globalization of the human economy and also food systems and the food regime. So you will see on the left-hand side there the idea that Panama provides a very narrow stretch of land that can be crossed in order to get from one ocean to the other, from the Pacific through to the Atlantic. And this, arguably, this geological factor defines the history of Panama for the entirety of its existence within the kind of the global sphere. So, as you will probably appreciate, Panama was discovered, quote unquote, by a number of Europeans, and particularly Spaniards, it's believed. And ever since the Spanish arrival in Panama, many other outside agents of influence and change have followed, not least myself. I think that I might have alluded to, so I lived and worked in Panama for a number of years before coming to work here at the University of Warwick. That's a picture of my my younger, slimmer self, and the arrow points to the place, the specific geography where I used to live and work. So up on what will be known as the northern or the west of Panama, as part of the Caribbean Sea. Now we zoom in on this geography as a way to help understand maybe somehow about how that physical geography might play into any particular food system or food regime that we wanted to analyze in the area. As you can see, it's an archipelago, so large parts of the inhabited space are made up of islands, but hopefully you'll see they're quite close to the mainland, which is on the left-hand side of the map. The dark grey colour on the right-hand side of the map indicates water. So not the best map, but hopefully you can see the islands there delineated, particularly in the rectangular box. Now the particular island I lived and worked on was Isla Colón. I was working as an academic there, so at an international field school. So we had a campus, but our campus looked a bit like this. And we also had a classroom, and our classroom looked a little bit like this. So very appropriate for COVID-safe operation, as compared with the classes that we're forced to manage with at the University of Warwick. But one of the great things about my job was that students would come and we would have some classes, but they would also engage in research led by the staff. So the information that I'm sharing with you is part of that experience. So some of the information that I'll be sharing was taught to me, if you like, or was created together with my students at the time. And what would be fantastic is if you're interested enough in this area, maybe you might like to contribute to the continuation of this knowledge creation, maybe through your assessment, possibly. So if that interests you, then that's fantastic. just as a point of departure for the narrative, so the island that I was based on is called Isla Colon. I wonder if you might have any thoughts as to why that might be, given what you know about Panama. This is an interesting historical reference, the idea that Christopher Columbus, the Spanish name for Christopher Columbus, well, at some point at least arrived and landed on the island. This is a claim made by lots of places along this coastline, so it may or may not be true, but starts to connect this part of the world with a more international and globalizing world system. Now, I think it's hopefully relevant and interesting to point out again. So the Panama offered the Spanish a land bridge between the two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. And the specific reason, or one of the main reasons that they identified this as an opportunity, was they were interested in extracting gold resources from the Incan Empire down on the South American continent, and they would ship those gold resources up to Panama. They'd be transported across the land, trekked through forests, and in some cases across lakes in boats, etc., to get out to the Atlantic side, where it would be shipped off back to the heart of the Spanish Empire in Spain, in Europe. So Panama was developed as a significant trade node. The main focus of activity was down in the south or the east of Panama, around Panama City. And for anyone who might be going on to do the cities module next year, we will look at Panama City in a similar context to try to understand that as an urban space. But the connection of Panama to the international economy and global system were developed. So in 1776, the United States of America won its independence from the British colonial control. And then the processes in North America start to affect Panama quite fundamentally. Now, something you might be aware of, so settlers landed on the east coast of what was then the United States and pushed west out into the frontiers for all sorts of livelihood opportunities, not least of which often included looking for gold reserves. And you've probably heard of the concept of a gold rush. There were lots of individuals interested in exploiting uncovered gold reserves out on the west coast. But making the journey from east to west was incredibly difficult because of the physical geography, because of the native peoples. So the Americans discovered that it actually made a lot more sense to ship themselves down from the east coast down to Panama, building on the Spanish tradition of using the land as a land bridge, and then to sail up the west coast. And this was, in many cases, a lot quicker, and in many cases, a lot safer. So this became a preferable route. So initially, this would be done by ship, and then the land would be crossed again on foot, carrying packages and materials on donkeys and beasts of burden, etc., or by local guides. However, such was the interest of the Americans in using this logistical route that they obtained permission to build a railway. Now, the railway was finished in 1855, and it starts a very interesting diplomatic interest and kind of international relations interest in the country. So America established its right to protect its railway interests, which it owned, which led to a number of latter incursions by US forces and other interests into Panama. But the railway increased the efficiency of this crossing and attracted more and more US interests into the country. The railway was built again in the sort of the southern and eastern region of Panama, where the area I want to focus on is up in the north. But I think it's fair to say that the development of the railway and then subsequent infrastructure was what really brought Panama onto the radar of many Americans, and it became known. The whole country became known as a place that could be engaged with. So I want to now start thinking about the north western part of the country where I was based, and drawing on a reasonably solid historical source here. So from the accounts of Roberts, published in 1826. Now, as you can read here, it's established that about 10 years, at least 10 years prior to this, and Americans' interests are regularly coming down to visit the area that is now Bocas del Toro for trade. So building on the sort of trade that might have happened with other indigenous communities from further up the coast, they were kind of extending this tradition. And as you can see, they come down to trade resources such as the tortoise shell, which we've talked about, certain types of tree and wood, gums, but also food resources. So sasapradias are pictured on the right-hand side. So it's a kind of fruit. And it's interesting here that Roberts notes that this business, this trade, is exceptionally lucrative for the American interests that are coming down, and that also then become based in the area as a point of contact. Now, there's many interesting aspects of this trade dynamic, but just one thing to point out in terms of the fruit. So the sasapradias are then marketed in the United States, not just as a foodstuff, but as carrying a medicinal benefit. In this case, the claim is that they're able to purify the blood and invigorate the whole bodily system. And this is an interesting insight to something else that hopefully you'll see as relevant. The way that exotic, quote unquote, foodstuffs are often marketed in a trade centre or a kind of colonial centre or an overseas market isn't just about their nature as food. It has other discourses laid over the top. So often kind of cures for illnesses and medicinal purposes. So this is, we start to see the trade of Bocas del Toro getting thickened, and I guess the internationalization increases. So there's a greater distance of trade and travel. Now this produces some really interesting and important effects. Now, the first thing to say is that the indigenous communities who would have lived in that area at this time, the Nobe, as well as all the other food resources that I made reference to, they drew heavily on local plants, both for nutrition and also for their own medicinal purposes. But there's something a bit more intellectually profound here that I want to pick up on, and I want to introduce it through the medium of this picture, which is a particular tree that they have in Panama and other places around. And this is commonly known as the walking palm. Now, as you can see from the picture, this palm is quite unique. It doesn't have one central trunk, as most palms and indeed most trees, but it grows a number of sort of equally sized trunks down to absorb the nutrients from the ground. However, the reason that it's called the walking palm, and if you ever go to Panama and you ever go on a tour of this area, it will inevitably be explained to you that this palm tree actually walks around the forest floor. And the story that will be told is that the palm moves into spaces of greater sunlight. So it will grow new trunks on the side where it wishes to advance, and it will slowly allow the trunks behind to die off, and in this way it will move. And there are a number of sort of distances cited for how far a tree might relocate itself in a certain space of time. But this is something that's widely talked about, and is a fantastic thing to hear about and to discover. But research that's been done relatively recently has uncovered something really interesting. So while I think it was comparing indigenous participants, but then also international participants, and I think they were often study abroad students who are attracted to this area for various reasons, and they were asked questions about how they understood the agency of plants in the natural world, and where the American participants would generally present the idea that they understood plants to have agency, so they created various processes of cause and effect. They understood this very much as a product of non-human forces and non-intentional agency, where the Nobe participants, even when this work was conducted relatively recently, were much more likely to identify the idea of intentionality to the agency of plants in the world. And I'm not sure if they would have used this walking palm as an example, but it hit me as something that was a nice illustration of this. And this gets to something, as I say, as a little bit more intellectually profound. So we have here a collision of different ontologies. And if you recall from environmental principles, the work that we did on this, ontology is the philosophical reflection on what the world is made of, and what the world is, and the different categories we use to conceptualize and interpret what's in the world around us. So a classic example would be the ontology of sort of a religious ontology that accepts active intentional agency of gods or more powerful beings, versus a secular ontology, which would probably recognize the belief in a god as a valid concept that's in the world, but would reject the idea that actually there are things that we should be calling gods and that have their own agency. So in this case, we can see a sort of an ontological clash, or maybe an ontological destabilization of local understandings as new understandings are brought in. And of course, once you start, the reason that ontology is so fascinating and so important is the categories, the things that you see in the world, and the categories that you use to interpret that dictate then how you think about it, how you create knowledge about it, and then how you behave in the world. So this research that was done recently is suggesting that it's because of these fundamental ontological differences that might help explain why indigenous communities may treat their natural environments with what we interpret as a kind of a respect and a deference, an effort to live in a symbiotic way, where Europeans and North Americans who have been subject to a very strong biblically driven and an understanding of the world driven by Christianity, and also the scientific enlightenment, treat the world then in a very different way. So where local indigenous communities might live symbiotically in a way that's we would perceive to respect the natural environment, European and North American discourses were driven by this idea that human beings had a right, maybe even an obligation, to extract and to use the natural environment, originally because it was the intention of God. So we have a whole interesting set of different ontological foundations getting mixed together here. And just as a final reflection, in order to try to talk about this, and I wanted to use the example of the walking palm, I tried to find some, because I'm a product of the Enlightenment and I believe in the scientific method, I went to try to find some solid evidence that this palm actually moves around. And I wasn't able to dedicate a huge amount of time to it, but actually I've been unable to discover this or to find any solid evidence. There's a lot of claims made around, particularly in the popular parts of the internet. Many sources that say, of course, this moves, people have seen it. Many sources that say this absolutely definitely doesn't move. There are sources that, there are scientific sources that support this. I'm talking about Wikipedia now, actually, as it happens. I then went off to find those scientific sources, and my conclusion was that the Wikipedia interpretation of those sources was inaccurate, because actually those that I looked at didn't even cover the question of whether the palm moved around. It was different research questions that were getting asked. So the point here is that ontological difference has such an impact on the way we build knowledge around about the world, to the extent that I here today am not able to clarify for you in a reasonable time frame actually what the truth, quote unquote, is about these palms. And hopefully you'll kind of see how this might impact food systems and all sorts of interactions with the natural environment. So moving on to tell the story of the increasing density of the interactions between Bocas del Toro and the wider world, and the effects that this had, it's really important to talk about the international banana industry. So this starts to kick off around the 1840s. Now you might have heard of the United Fruit Company. This grows into a huge organization that covers the whole continent, right from the United States, which is the primary market for sale, all the way down through Central into South America, down to Colombia and I think other countries, which are the sites of production for bananas. There are many interesting videos. The United Fruit Company has a very torrid and ethically dubious history in the way that it has influenced all sorts of things that have happened in Central and South America. So actually, I'm going to post a little video, I think, that helps you understand that. But obviously, as such a massive company, I'm giving you a bit of a clue here. I hadn't intended to do this. The way that it was able to use capital that was accumulated in certain ways through the development and application of technology really started to change the food system locally and the wider economy. So in order to grow and get bananas out, new infrastructure was needed. So here we have a picture of the United Fruit Company building a dock. The equipment in the background is part of the construction equipment, but you can see the dock getting constructed. And I think it's probably drawing on wood, it's drawing on metallic technologies, which would have been brought down from the United States in the north. The United Fruit Company it was really wrapped up in the development of railways. And in fact, arguably that's what started the major part of the company. But they use railways as a way to extract the bananas from the sites of growing that might be a little bit inland, to get them to the ports to then ship them out. So again, this type of technology drove things. Now, as this geography was identified as a fantastic place to grow bananas by cutting and leveling areas of the tropical forest and building planting banana plantations, using up the nutrients in the soil that would eventually become depleted and then moving on again, obviously radically changed both the ecology of the area and entirely transformed the economy in terms of both the local people and the international interests. It, of course, hugely impacted the environment, not just in terms of the banana plantations themselves, but because of the economic activity, it became an increasing centre for more and more in-migration of people from other parts of the world. And one of the particular communities that came in were from the West Indies. One of the starting purposes for that was eventually, while the railway in Panama was of so much value, eventually a canal was built, and a lot of West Indians were brought in to provide the labour for that. Now, once that project was finished, or many moved on in the area to find other work, and it was the banana industry that drew them. So we get this great inflow of human migration into Bocas del Toro, and therefore the building of urban space. To cut a long story short, no one really wanted to live inland in the sort of tropical forest area, so they built new land on the outside, round the coast. And this is a picture of the stone retaining wall that's been built, that was then backfilled with land and debris, because there were concerns about the way that mangrove forests that had initially been used as the sites for houses harboured disease and health problems, which we know is accurate because of we now understand malaria. So this economic activity was literally creating the land that people lived on, and was bringing in all these technologies to facilitate this. So this is an historical picture of the centre of the town, on Isla Colón, where I lived, all of which, as far as I understand, was land that's been built, as opposed to land that existed when these interests came in. And you can see that a process of urbanisation starts to begin. As well as all those technologies, the extraction of bananas required the shipping up to the northern markets, and refrigeration becomes a really important driver of the ability of banana industries to feed northern market demands. So refrigeration becomes possible around the sort of the 1870s, and then becomes a key technology used by the United Fruit Company. A picture of their white fleet boats that we can see here. As I mentioned, the production of bananas was also driven by access to certain human resources, and a lot of these were West Indian. And something to say that this, throughout, as with all of Central and South America, population changes are constantly overlaid with very deep and, I guess, ontologically rooted discrimination and racism around the different hierarchies of different ethnicities. And I think so. This is a quotation from 1914, actually from a written piece. So a United Fruit Company publicist. So this was someone who knew they were speaking to, I guess, a wider public, and were seeking to actually extol the virtues and the values of the for-profit company. And as you can see there, the implicit assumptions that they have about the nature of West Indian labourers, that I think, yes, they term in this case as Jamaican Negroes, but also talking about Central American Indians. It's a fantastic interpretation. The idea that they lack the altruism that impels some men, presumably white men, to work when they're not watched. And this creates a logistical problem, because we can't possibly watch basically all these lazy Negroes and these Indians who aren't going to work properly. So you can understand the type of intellectual framework that's getting brought by these outside interests, and you can probably imagine what kind of effect that has in terms of the way that labour is treated and the way that people then live. This is a fairly broad brush summary, but essentially I think it's clear that empirically the people at the top of this pyramid were the white northern owners. So the United Fruit Company was owned by financial interests in the United States of America. As is often the way, the managers and the technical experts who would work on the banana plantations in around Bocas del Toro were exclusively white, most likely to be from North America, or in some cases they were Europeans. They might also have come from the kind of the white social classes of Panama, thinking back to the history with Spain, etc. Then in the social hierarchy, we understand were the West Indian workers, who were considered by the white managers to have actual skills to bring. So it was known that these people had been involved through the Caribbean in the production of commodity crops like bananas. They of course spoke English, which was seen as a skill, and therefore it made them important sort of sub-managers or overseers, people who would be left with the responsibility. So they would be drawn from Panama, or they might arrive initially from their home countries overseas. At the very bottom of the racial hierarchy and the sort of the employment relations pyramid were the indigenous populations, who had obviously lived there for many decades previously, because they certainly weren't likely to speak English, were probably very unlikely even to speak Spanish, and they came from traditional livelihoods. They were considered to be the unskilled labour, and they are the ones that would always be bearing the brunt of the kind of the hardest and the most basic manual work. And it is, I think, without question, fair to say that this is a racial hierarchy that's continued. This was established in around the later 1800s or before, and very much exists when you start to see beneath the surface of the Panamanian culture and the Panamanian economy today. And in fact, if we look on the right-hand side, this is a photograph that I took in a fair trade banana factory, banana processing plant that we visited with our students while I was working in Bocas. And you can see that the individual here, who's doing essentially unskilled manual labour, is a member of the Nobe indigenous community. As we might well expect, there were few white owners at the top, and there were many indigenous unskilled labourers at the bottom. quite whether it's fair to say there were necessarily less West Indian skilled workers. I'm not 100% sure. But of course, you appreciate the effect. And in terms of economic remuneration, again, as we would very much expect, the people at the bottom of the pyramid are earning the less, are earning the least, and being subject to the least desirable working conditions and treatment. And of course, the pyramid is inverted up to the white northern owners, who were accumulating the most of the capital that was getting created and extracted from this system. Coming back down the pyramid, the people at the bottom were suffering the greatest social and physical, what we might now term as externalities of the market price. So they were the ones that were without proper employment contracts, healthcare, housing, good food, etc. And hopefully that makes intuitive sense. We can see the effects of this, and it's partly the empirics that I've drawn on to create that impression. The history of the United Fruit Company is characterized by worker protest about all sorts of things that difficult and very ethically dubious situations that they experienced, including outright strikes in protest of low levels of remuneration and worker treatment. By contrast, just as an illustration, so one of the founders of the United Fruit Company, they started out in Costa Rica in San Jose, and because of the capital they accumulated, they were able to live a life of great kind of patronage and luxury. So if you look at some of the most prominent things within San Jose, such as the theatre that still exists today, this was a result of investments by this one individual and his family, who'd extracted all the surplus from these supply chains around the food product and as part of the food system, as part of the food regime. Damn it, wasn't supposed to talk about food regimes, but hopefully it helps you see the connections. Now, it's, of course, obvious that this interaction between the human economy and the local ecology had many dimensions and many outcomes. You've probably likely heard of the idea of Panama disease, which strikes at banana crops. And it's called Panama disease because it was first identified in Panama around 1910. Now, there's been lots and lots of efforts to treat Panama disease and to fight it. One of the commercial responses has been to diversify business away from just growing bananas. So for a little while, United Fruit Company tried to get into other products such as Manila hemp, but also cacao, which, as you all know, produces chocolate. So the United Fruit Company, when it saw the threat to its banana business, started to use the same infrastructure and the same labour structures to produce cacao. And of course, it was something that the company could identify was a very prominent part of local culture and the local ecology. So they just wanted to scale it up and commercialise it. As a result of this effort, actually, Bocas del Toro becomes one of what's argued to be the world's biggest cacao producing area, with one of the islands, so Almirante, having what's claimed to be the largest cacao processing plant in the world. So there is a significant readjustment away from bananas towards cacao, although at the same time, the United Fruit Company was continuing to find other ways of dealing with the Panama disease in order to protect and to extend its interests. Just on that, it's probably worth saying at this point that the United Fruit Company subsequently then became Chiquita, and Chiquita you will probably recognize as a brand of bananas that are still available today in the supermarkets, certainly in Coventry and throughout the UK and in North America. So the company has continued. Just to look a little bit more about the interactions between an effort to produce what we can see as a food crop and the natural environment. So this is a graph that I've constructed along together with a previous student of mine in Panama, looking at all sorts of records And this is to our, this is the best understanding that we can construct from the available data that we could find. So starting around 1915, when it's about the time that Panama disease is kicking into Panama, so this is thousands of metric tons of cacao produced out of Bocas specifically. No, apologies. Produced out of Panama, but within which the area of Bocas was the most prominent concentration of production. So we can see fortunes rising considerably and dropping. This could be issues with our data, but it also could be the result of environmental shock and all sorts of other economic shocks that dip production. But you'll see over time, things really start to peter out. And the thing that really killed large amounts of cacao investments in Central and South America was the entry into the global market of cacao production in West Africa, which is, if you're eating cacao these days in Europe, is most likely to be the source of that. They were able to produce cacao much more cost effectively for certainly a European market. So the fortunes of cacao kind of rose and then fell in Bocas and Panama. To continue the story, to understand the context of the food system in this area of the world and maybe the food regime, it's useful to look at a photograph that was given to me by one of our collaborators in Bocas, Clyde Stevens. Now, he was a very interesting character. He was originally from the United States. He worked for Chiquita as a technician, actually in the department responsible for trying to deal with the Panama disease. He was also a fantastic local historian, and he had lots of really cool resources. So this is a photograph of the main town on Isla Colón, where I lived. And the building on the farthest right-hand side, that is the headquarters of the United Fruit Company, I think in its second location, when it was moved from Almirante. Now you can see from the nature of the buildings and the car that's in the picture, this puts us in a certain historical period. So this is probably still in the late 1800s, although I don't have a date. If you were to go to that spot now, as indeed I have been, you would see that the original headquarters is now a hotel, the Grand Hotel Bahia. This is a nicely illustrative picture because Bocas has now, banana plantations have moved onto the mainland. So Chiquita do still have some banana producing interests in the general region, but not on the islands as they used to be. The islands have gone through various cycles. So there's some, again, the cacao played a big part in the development of commercial activities, but has also fallen away. There's a few small-scale chocolate farms or cacao farms still around that we visited, but tourism has now taken over as probably the central driver in this economy, as somewhat of a natural extension of this huge influx of international interests from the Caribbean and also from North America. So if you pop off and search Bocas del Toro now, you will find lots of pictures like this and lots of sets of knowledge and information, such as this taken from the Lonely Planet. Lots of backpackers, lots of young people on their various tours, etc., as well as lots of retired US families. So Panama is a big center for what's referred to in the literature as lifestyle migration. And the rather unfortunate story is that lots of Americans unable to really afford a suitable retirement in the United States for various reasons look to other countries in Central America as a place where this is possible. And Panama is a big center of this, and Panama has actually worked actively to attract these sorts of people. There are some people who just come because they like it, but there is then a big kind of US diaspora across these islands, attracted by what you can of course see is the promise of a paradise retirement or a paradise escape. Although the degree to which that is true, I think is very, very questionable. But that's something to talk about in a different module. What it should hopefully see as being relevant is how this should play into the contemporary food system of Bocas. Just a few other little bits and pieces of background that I want to share with you, and this is probably this is implicit in the idea of the economic changes, but changes of energy production. You'll recall that in the previous little video snippet that I offered on Nobe Technologies prior to the arrival of international interests, cooking was done by using wood, and burning wood was the primary fuel for both heating and light and cooking. Now, Isla Colon it's actually not this particular plant, but it has a diesel energy production plant, which we also visited with our students. So the island is now electrified, which, as you can imagine, has implications for the food system and for the food regime. In addition to the arrival of people from the West Indies, from North America, from Europe, Panama also has a very long history of migrants coming from China. They came and provided a lot of the labor for the initial railroad construction and other things, but have also developed a very strong participation in trade with Panama, and particularly the idea of the Chinese supermarket. Now, I think that when I lived there, Isla Colon was served by something like 6 or 8 supermarkets, like the one you can see in the picture, run by Chinese families. Really interesting integrated businesses. So, supermarket on the bottom, probably a lodge or a boarding house on the second floor, and then the family also live within the building. They have connected themselves to the international supply chain of durable food products that have come in from all over the world. So you can see here that the indigenous practices of drawing on marine resources for protein are no longer necessary on the islands, because you can buy tins of Atlantic tuna or whatever it is. In fact, that whole wall pretty much looks like tuna and other fish. So this is now a strong part of the food system, both in terms of distribution and also kind of the cultural difference. And the Chinese families on the island tend to be very culturally robust. So their diets are still very much of a relatively authentic Chinese type. The other thing that these sorts of retail investments and connections to international supply chains has brought is all sorts of capital goods and technologies, from bicycles to wheelbarrows. And of course, this also has dramatically changed the technologies that can be used in houses for those people who can afford it, obviously, in terms of the food system. So I'm being obvious about it again, but here we have food preservation. So that idea of refrigeration technology applied to the home just as much as it might be to international logistics. And of course, now instead of using burning wood, the options for gas and also, for electricity and also for gas cookers are a possibility on the islands. Just, I think, finally, along with the development of tourism, have come a lot of investments by international people and international families to come to live, to create a livelihood around this tourism. And of course, food is a big part of tourism. This is one of I think the singular supermarket that's a little bit different on Isla Colon. So this is Super Gourmet, which is run by an American couple or family, I forget. But they have a very different set of products. So this is pitched at the kind of the higher end food market with fresh produce, so like tomatoes, watermelons we can see here. Of course, the ubiquitous supply of rum and what have you, but also more high-end durable foods. So those of you who've cooked in the UK and been to the supermarket, you probably recognise Patak's curry paste. This is the Vindaloo variety. So if you weren't getting food poisoning enough from the local restaurants where the hygiene standards aren't necessarily great, you can come and get a Vindaloo paste and try to achieve the same effect. But all sorts of lots of top-end products here. So this now concludes my whirlwind tour of some empirical aspects about the history of Bocas that should hopefully help you to assemble an understanding of food regimes over time And for those of you who have been thinking carefully and thinking back to the idea of food regimes, which is trying to identify not just the sort of the character of a particular food system or food regime, but the things that drive changes within it, you might well be able to see some stereotyped emergence of some different stages, possibly, and the different characteristics of certain aspects within each of those stages. What I'd like you to do now is to have a bit of a think about that. So head back to the Moodle and I'll provide some instructions there. But ultimately, what I want to bridge towards is getting you guys to think actively about, well, based on what you know, what sorts of outcomes might be happening for the food system, for the food regime here. And then after I've got you to think about it for yourselves, I'm then going to plug in some extra knowledge to help validate and understand that.